Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today is April the 9th, 2023, and we are here to talk about the world with some world discussion with Agent Smith. Current events, news, foreign policy, economics, world history, all of this is on the table as we play some StarCraft 2 in the background. Without any further delays, let's find out what's happening with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey.
Good
How are
evening.
you?
Pretty good. Happy Easter.
I keep forgetting it's Easter.
Did you not have an egg hunt?
I haven't had an egg hunt in 10 years, 15 years,
Wow.
probably longer.
Yeah, there are probably eggs all over the yard and you just didn't even know.
I don't know about that.
I haven't done an Easter egg hunt in 1 year exactly. I did one last year.
Oh, so you're right on schedule then.
Yeah. Yeah, not doing one this year because I'm not visiting family for Easter, but visited parents last time and they hid some eggs all over the property. When you're a kid, having candy in the eggs is a good surprise. When you're an adult, $5 bill in that? Hell yeah. That'll motivate an adult.
There you go. A little lunch money for you.
Yeah. Yep, I had another trip to LA last Sunday. That was cool. Got to play Stormgate once again. We also went to an animal sanctuary and I got to meet lots of cool animals that I'd never met before, like a pig. They had goats there, sheep, cows. It was funny seeing the difference between GMO cows and non-GMO cows. It's about 1,000 to 2,000 pound difference. The GMO ones are just huge. And they had an emu, which was really cool.
Oh,
Land birds. Have you heard about the emu war of Australia?
it sounds familiar. What was that?
They call it an emu war. Basically, it was them encouraging people to just like try to lower the population as much as they could, just because they're kind of ornery creatures or whatever. But people like to say that the emus won because they were not wiped out by this. But emus are pretty feisty creatures. They're fairly tall. The one that I met stood about 5 feet tall, and they have like raptor toes.
Yeah, they're pretty big dinosaurs.
Yeah. What else did they have there? Horses and donkeys and that kind of thing. Yeah, that was cool. I also checked in with chat before we started and got a sense of what people want to hear about today.
Sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
Anything in particular?
Well, some of the stuff is what we've touched on before. We don't need to tackle these in any particular order, but there are people asking about the situation in France and the protests and if anything has changed there. There's the Trump court case thing. There are a few like state politics questions. Yeah, we could hit them one at a time, I guess.
Works with me. It's all right with you.
Yeah.
I have been a little busy the past week in particular with proofreading, so I'm not as up to date on the most recent stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I would add that as a preface to our segment today.
Cool. So we'll start with a saucy one. Is Trump actually in trouble this time, or is this more just shit in the news that's going to fade away in a couple weeks?
It's not going to fade away in a couple weeks. It's going to be a running thing, a running source of drama, but realistically, there's only so much trouble he can really get in over that. I think the most likely outcome is that he gets fined, even if he is found guilty. It's not really one of the more serious charges that has been levied against him. Certainly among those that have been levied and then resulted in actual investigations. Yeah, probably the investigation over his involvement in pressuring the Secretary of State, I think it is, in Georgia during the 2020 election. That's probably one of the more serious ones.
Was that part of the same case?
No, it is not. That is actually a separate case.
So there are two cases ongoing.
Well, there's also well, no, there's a third one as well, I think, but I don't remember off the top of my head what that was.
Oh.
Yeah, but the Georgia one is the main one, I think. Yeah, I think his name was Rafsenberger, if I'm not mistaken.
Main one is in the one that's the most dangerous to Trump's career, or?
Well, the one that could result in the most serious charges
Uh-huh.
if he were to be found guilty.
The one where he's paying the hush money to people, that one I read as being like a business fraud thing.
I think it's more campaign finance, technically.
Oh.
Because the money, it's not illegal to pay somebody off like that.
Yeah.
But the issue is that it could be interpreted as benefiting his campaign for office, and in so much as it did, it could be considered money that went towards his campaign, and as such, technically should have been reported as such. But as was, it was not reported.
Yeah, I read that he reported it as legal fees or something.
Yeah, yeah. So there's some debate about how that payment should have been classified, and whether or not it should have been reported as part of normal campaign spending. So that's kind of more what the case is focused on. But that's basically like an accounting thing. So it's not that serious in the grand scheme of things. It was a big deal because it just was a big headline to have a former president be indicted at all. It had never happened before. So it was newsworthy for that reason, but it's not likely to really seriously harm his political aspirations in so much as he has any. If anything, it's been boosting him. I think before the indictment, he had around a 10-point lead over DeSantis as far as the Republican nomination for the presidential election in 2024. But after the indictment, it's more like a 20-point lead, 24-point lead, something like that in the polls. So, it's definitely boosted him. And again, even if he's found guilty, it's not really going to seriously impede his drive for the presidency. Even if he ends up in jail, there's not technically any law that would prevent him from still running, even in that case.
You can run for president from jail?
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. I'm not a lawyer. I invite anybody who knows better to correct me on that. But yeah, that is my understanding. So he'll be fine. Long story short.
Yeah. One of the candidates from the United States of America running for president coming at you live from jail. Just sounds really absurd to me. But we live in strange times, so.
Well, c'est la vie.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm a lot more interested in the Rafsenberger case. That one had very clear direct involvement of the president. And it was pretty clear what they were angling to do. So I think he's on much more difficult ground there, and the charges involved are more serious. So that, I think, is going to be more the star attraction.
What's the charge there? What would it be classified as?
I'm not sure technically what it is. It's something like election interference or subversion. It's one of the bigger ones, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what it was. But from what I've read from analysts, that's considered the most serious case. So something to keep an eye on.
So he could go from being at court in one state to going to court in Georgia? Because he's in New York for this one.
Yeah. The current one is New York. The other one I believe is in Georgia. So yeah, he would. That's not necessarily uncommon. It's possible to get in trouble in multiple places at the same time, depending on how much of a troublemaker you are. So yeah, they'll kind of work around his schedule as necessary to make that work, if indeed the two cases end up conflicting with each other in terms of their demands on Mr. Trump's time.
Mm-hmm.
But that shouldn't be too much of a problem.
Hey, do you have time to go to jail the next few days? Sorry, I'm busy. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I think the DA in New York actually did kind of negotiate an agreement with him, wherein he would just kind of surrender so that there wasn't any kind of perp walk or anything that would turn into like a big media storm. Which is not to say that
like being cuffed and stuff.
Yeah. That's kind of what they usually do, and taking mug shots and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I heard that he was upset that he didn't get a mug shot.
Wouldn't surprise me. He's been milking it for everything it's worth.
Yeah.
They're trying to make it out like the DA of New York City is out to get him, and it's just all political, and it's all just bullshit and all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was a big rally actually here in Dallas around the time I think just before the indictment, and a lot of the people there were saying that it was bullshit, and that they would not care basically if he were found guilty. They said that they were just assuming that it was all just a witch hunt. One of the phrases that gets bandied around a lot is weaponizing the judicial system. That's turned into a big sort of battle cry on the political right in the United States over the past year or two.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really think that's what's happening here. That's not to say that there have not been politicized cases before, and that there won't be any again. There certainly will be. But I don't think the whole system is just corrupt from top to bottom, like people at the rally seem to make it out to be. But that's just what happens when people lose faith in the political system. When people lose trust in society, they tend to go looking for love in all the wrong places, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, when you're in the political sphere, I think it can make you more suspicious that people are trying to set you behind for their own advantage. Because if the more trouble he gets in, the more that it benefits his enemies. So it would make sense for someone to be suspicious and be like, well, they're doing this to get me, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens about that. But yeah, the election interference is definitely a more grave and serious crime than misreporting your expenses.
Yeah, we'll see what comes of that.
And then some other stuff that people mentioned. There was a lawmaker in North Carolina, I think. Or was it South Carolina? I think it was Charlottesville, South Carolina. That's supposed to be a really blue district, and they ran Democrat and then flipped Republican, and now they have a super majority.
I saw that on Reddit.
Yeah,
so I know what they're talking about.
Yeah,
it was a woman who ran as a Democrat. She won, and then just recently she was complaining. Well, she switched parties, and then she justified it by saying that she felt like the Democratic Party was, and particularly maybe Democratic voters, were putting a lot of pressure on her that she didn't feel comfortable with. Supposedly over this, that, or the other specific political issue that she was relatively more conservative than them on. So I did notice a lot of angst on Reddit over that, saying that, it was just a long con. That she was secretly Republican and just ran as a Democrat so that South Carolina? I think it was North Carolina. So the North Carolina GOP could have a majority, have another seat, basically. But in this case, it was particularly notable because with her flipping parties, the North Carolina GOP has a veto-proof majority in their legislature. So that was a significant win for the Republican Party there. And they can pass bills now and not have to worry about whether or not the governor likes them or doesn't like them. Yeah, I kind of felt, I tried to look into it. It's actually a little hard to find too much data or articles and stuff on like really small districts like that, especially at a state level. But from what I was finding, it wasn't really this deep blue district like people were kind of making it out to be. At least that wasn't my impression. If you look at the Wikipedia page for the district, it'll kind of show you who's been winning, basically. And it's kind of gone back and forth. I think there was a 10-year period, roughly, where it was won by a Republican and by relatively healthy margins. And then 10 years, I think, before that, there was a streak of 10 years where the Democrats were winning it. I would note, too, though, that districts are generally redesigned every 10 years after each census is finished. And the district seems to have undergone a lot of changes, more so than is perhaps usual. So it could well be the case that the district has been redesigned to be a majority Democrat district to a Republican majority district and then back to a Democrat majority district. I don't discount that possibility. But just looking at the historical record of who's been winning, it's gone back and forth, and that kind of suggests to me that it's not really deep blue. So if it is more of a centrist district currently, with the current design of the district, the politicians that have been winning the district probably are more centrist in nature. And that implies that, center right or center left, pretty similar in a lot of ways, but they don't have their own party. So switching parties doesn't necessarily mean that much in terms of how they're going to vote. Now, of course, that remains to be seen. We'll see how she actually does change her behavior here once she, now that she's made the change. But my immediate suspicion is that she's actually not going to change how she votes that much. That would be my guess. This is probably more of a strategic move for her, more than it is a significant marker of, stabbing her voters in the back or anything like that. I did see that in the most recent election, there were 3, I think, progressive candidates, and she was the more moderate candidate. So I'm talking about the Democratic primary for the office that she ended up winning in the district. So she ran as a moderate Democrat against 3 separate progressive candidates. And I noted that if there had only been one progressive candidate, and assuming that all of the supporters of those 3 progressive candidates had voted for the one candidate, it seems like they would have won. So one could argue that the district is progressive leaning for that reason. But as was, they lost. And it may be that even if they'd won, then maybe that would have just handed the district over to the GOP. Again, without knowing more about the district, I can't really say for sure. But just given what limited information I have thus far, I can't really agree that it's necessarily the case that it's a deep blue district that had a moderate candidate, stab their voters in the back. There's not enough information right now to support that. So again, if somebody knows better in chat, please let me know. But just off of my limited research, it kind of seemed like the internet was just hyperventilating again.
Chat's asking if this is any sort of precedent or indication that party flipping may become more of a norm, because I don't think it's that normal.
It's not that common, but it does happen. I don't think I haven't seen it happening more over the past 10 years. And I don't know why, this person flipping would necessarily make it more likely or to mark some kind of shift in the trend or mark the beginning of a trend. I don't see any underlying structural change in American politics that would lead people to start flipping parties more often. Generally when it happens, it happens when there's centrists that maybe have a falling out with their party or maybe feel like their prospects would be better if they switch parties. But generally, it doesn't mark like a change in individual politics. It's, again, more of a strategic move by individual politicians. I think maybe this isn't a great example because he didn't switch parties, but Joe Lieberman back in Massachusetts, like 20-some years ago, had been a Democrat, and he ended up losing a primary, which he didn't like. So he left the Democratic Party and became an independent and ran as such and actually did win. He still caucused with the Democrats in Congress. This was a national level office that he was running for. So he still caucused with Democrats, meaning that he kind of generally voted with them. But he technically was not still a member of the party.
Mm.
So I think party flipping in the U.S. generally is more indicative of that kind of behavior than it is anything.
Yeah, well, what you're saying, it sounds like this person who flipped was more purple than like true blue anyway. So
Yeah.
of people who could flip, it's like the most likely.
Yeah, because again, center right and center left have a lot in common, so you don't really have to change that much. U.S. politics works very different. For those of you listening from outside the United States, this is going to be obvious to people who live here, but for those of you living outside the United States listening, you should know that political parties in the United States are really more just labels. They don't really have very strong organization, such that they can kind of force you to vote in a certain way or behave in a certain way. There has been a trend over the past 20 years where parties have gotten relatively stronger, and that has put more pressure on people to kind of vote the party line, regardless of whether or not they want to. But in general, political parties in the United States are still way, way weaker than European political parties, which tend to have a lot more organizational structure and internal discipline as far as ensuring the people who are members of the party and the people representing the party in government vote according to a given party line. So in the US, it's not really that big a deal if you switch a political party or what have you. Again, it's just changing the label.
Yeah, party loyalty is less of a big deal then, I guess.
Yeah, in the United Kingdom, voting against the party is a really good way to get kicked out, basically. They don't like doing that. They prefer to kind of allow people to vote their conscience, especially if they're in a district where people are not necessarily fully committed to the party. But if you are vulnerable and you vote against the party, they will come after you, for sure. Boris Johnson kind of did that at one point during one of his controversies, of which there are more than a few. Both approaches have their merits. It's easier to ensure that the party is cohesive and that your party's political power in government is not undermined by your rivals. If you can make sure that all of your members in a given legislature are supporting the party line, you can get more done that way, and it's just easier to govern, basically. But the downside is that it's a little harder for people to vote their conscience. And in that sense, it can be harder for people who live in district or maybe a majority disagrees with their representative's party's line to kind of have that represented in how their representative votes. So in the United States, that's more the advantage. There's a lot more flexibility and discretion given to representatives of districts to represent the specific desires and demands and preferences of their constituents rather than those of a broader political party.
Yeah, that's an interesting difference. Voting for your constituents' opinion versus voting for your party's opinion. I think from the voter's perspective, you kind of prefer if it's the constituent.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little more power for you as an individual.
Yeah.
But then it may be that voting for your constituents just results in you throwing away a vote.
Yeah.
And maybe that there's no point. So in that sense, it can be better to trade that for support on some other issue. And in that sense, by doing that, you may end up voting with your party, even if it's not necessarily in the interests or desired by your constituents, to ensure that you're not wasting votes, just symbolically representing people to no discernible gain for your constituents or yourself, for that matter. So in that sense, you effectively end up behaving similar to a politician in a system where parties are stronger. But some issues are just too important, to not vote in a certain way, even if it means you're just sort of pissing it away. So in the American system, you can do that. without having to worry about re-election, unless the party just is really pissed off with you, in which case maybe they primary you, but that's a whole other issue.
What does it mean to primary you?
The party can basically fund a candidate to run against you in a primary for your office.
Whoa.
Normally incumbents basically automatically are granted the party's nomination to run for their office again, but it's possible for them to actually run somebody against you in the primary so that you lose the party's nomination and somebody else gets it, at which point you basically just have to run as an independent. Mm-hmm. Which may or may not be a bad thing, depending on how committed people in your constituency are to the party that you had been a member of. If you were kind of free riding on the brand of the party, that could be a problem for you. But on the other hand, if you've built up your own brand in your constituency, that'll really kind of give you immunity to that to some degree. You may still lose, but you've got a better chance if you kind of have your own identity, and also if you have your own organization. The Democratic Party doesn't really lend a whole lot of assistance relative to, say, European parties in terms of helping lower level candidates, that is to say, down ballot candidates, as we call them here in the United States, with their campaign. But the more money you can raise yourself, and the more you control your own campaign as an organization, the more independence you have from the party and the more discretion you have, just broadly speaking.
So there was that happened in the US. There was also people asking about a Pentagon data leak.
Yeah, I was actually reading about that today. Yeah, I saw the headline, and I didn't end up getting around to reading it until today. Let me see. I took notes on it. Yeah, well, I mean, when I first read about it, I kind of assumed that I would be reading more about it because it kind of sounded important. But then I was reading about it today and the actual contents of the leak, and it's not that bad, actually. I think the bigger problem with the leak is not the information itself that was leaked, but more so the fact that there was leak at all. Because this was sensitive information. It was classified. It was information that the U.S. government would rather have not been, leaked to, all and sundry. So the fact that the information did end up getting leaked suggests that there's some security problems within the intelligence apparatus, which is a problem in and of itself, but also it's a problem because it damages the reputation of said intelligence apparatus. If people are going to have confidence in you, they need to know that you're not going to do shit like this. And if they don't have that confidence, then they're less likely to want to cooperate with you or to share sensitive information that they have collected and which may be of interest to you. So it's going to shake the faith of American allies a little bit. Not great in that sense.
Yeah, intelligence sharing doesn't seem as attractive whenever the intelligence is being leaked.
Yeah, and that's actually something that the United States has criticized some of its allies for. Specifically Japan. Japan has kind of been making an effort over the past 10 years to try to build up American confidence in its intelligence apparatus enough such that it could gain, maybe not admission per se, that's probably not the right word, but such that it could join effectively Five Eyes. Five Eyes being the intelligence, the informal, shall we say, intelligence cooperation between the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Japan would very much like to kind of integrate more with that so that it can benefit, but the United States has been very skeptical about the degree of professionalism in Japan's intelligence apparatus, to the point where Washington just does not have sufficient confidence that Japan would be able to handle and protect sensitive materials such that Washington would be comfortable sharing them. So, we've dished out a fair amount of criticism on this count ourselves. So now we're looking a little hypocritical in light of the recent leaks, unfortunately.
You guys
So that's
need to do better with securing your data. Meanwhile,
yeah, it's not a good look. So the government's definitely going to try to figure out what happened there. It's not really readily clear at this point what the issue was. Maybe it was a hack, or maybe somebody was just a dumbass and leaked it by accident, or maybe on purpose, not necessarily even maliciously. Maybe it's a War Thunder type leak. We've been getting a lot of those recently over the past year.
what's a War Thunder leak?
Are you familiar with the game War Thunder?
I've heard the name. I haven't played it.
World of Tanks? Have you heard of that?
Yes, I played World of Tanks.
So War Thunder is the same thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's World of Tanks, World of Ships, World of Planes. War Thunder is basically all three. That's not to say that you can all play in the same game with tanks fighting against planes and ships and whatnot, but they have separate servers for each, land, air, and sea. But instead of having separate games, it's all just technically one game, War Thunder. So the issue is that people who play these kinds of games are sort of military otaku, right? They really love hardware.
Mm-hmm.
And so they argue with each other, right? You know how nerds are. They love to argue about the thing that they love, and they try to kind of one-up each other in terms of their knowledge about the given subject matter. And same thing happens in War Thunder, as well as World of Tanks and other types of games like this. And so one of the ways that people have tried to win arguments about whether or not this tank is better than that tank or what have you, they'll actually take plans that are classified about the vehicles in question and post them, or otherwise share them in the community.
You mean like the real life plans of that military item?
Yeah.
Wow, that's funny.
Yeah, it's happened. It's happened more than once now, and in separate countries.
Where do they get this kind of stuff?
They're employees. They actually work for the government. They have direct access to the material. There's no shortage of war nerds in government, as well as nerds in general. Unfortunately, some of them tend to be a little cavalier about the material that they handle. So hypothetically, this leak could be something like that. I did read that the initial leak was on social media, as well as video game message boards, which kind of raised a red flag immediately for me.
Mm.
But I don't know. Maybe it was a hack. It could have been anything. So they're going to look into it. We'll hear more about it later, I'm sure. But for now, it's mostly just in the embarrassing phase as far as its impact. So let's see. As far as like some of the specific things, South Korea's government, I should say, has apparently been a little concerned about the United States asking for ammunition, specifically 155 millimeter artillery ammunition from South Korea. Apparently, South Korea's government has a policy by which they do not sell weapons to countries at war. And they wanted to hold themselves to that. Because the reason that's relevant here is because the South Korean government suspected that the United States government wanted to buy ammunition from South Korea so that we could give it to Ukraine, which of course is almost certainly exactly what we were doing. So the South Korean government was a little concerned about that and didn't really know what to do about it, apparently. They didn't I don't think they resisted it. I don't think they said no. If I remember correctly, the sale did go through, but they were a little reluctant. I think the other notable thing there was that a lot of the intelligence gathered about these items, including the fact that the South Korean government was kind of at pains to agree to sell the ammunition. Part of the issue is that the United States gathered this intelligence by way of signals intelligence, which is sort of the fancy spy way of saying that we were wiretapping them. Maybe not necessarily wiretapping, that's a very specific thing, but eavesdropping on them electronically, let's say. In other words, spying on them, which is not really surprising. As spycraft professionals always say, when incidents like this happen, everybody spies on everybody. So that's not unusual in and of itself. But it is embarrassing when it comes out, especially when it's found that you're spying on an ally.
Yeah.
Because even if the counterparty, even if the allied government kind of knows probably that you're spying on them and doesn't necessarily mind all that much, when it becomes public, it puts them in a position where they have to be upset about it publicly. Because voters don't really like being spied on or don't like their governments being spied on.
Yeah.
So it's very awkward for allied governments then, because then they have to do performative outrage. Or even worse, they actually are outraged, and then you have a whole diplomatic problem. I don't think we'll have diplomatic problems with Seoul. The current government is fairly pro-American overall. But regardless, the government has been put in an awkward position on account of the leak, and that's not ideal.
I just love that phrase, performative outrage.
Well, there's a lot of kabuki theater like that in diplomacy. It's just kind of an inherent part of the trade.
Look, we're supposed to be very upset about this, so just bear with us as we yell about you to our constituents. Then we can go back to our regularly scheduled alliance.
Happens a lot. It happens a lot. So let's see, that was South Korea. Israel also was the subject of some of the stuff in the leak. Apparently, the United States government has been kind of trying to figure out different scenarios in which the Israeli government might consider sending lethal aid to Ukraine. As of now, they are not doing so that they can try to manage their relations with Russia. Russia still has troops and provides support to and in Syria. And the Israeli government is very sensitive to that, with the result that the Israeli government has been very reluctant to clear any sale of lethal weapons or other equipment to Ukraine. I do believe they've been sending and selling some non-lethal equipment, but lethal equipment, not so much. So the United States government was trying to figure out, okay, under what circumstances would they change that policy? And the most likely one they found was that Israel might adopt the Turkish model under U.S. pressure, which is to say that they kind of maintain a nominal neutrality about the conflict, but still sell weapons and whatnot. Some of the other scenarios might include Russia transferring strategic systems to Iran, or perhaps even expanding assistance to Iran's missile and nuclear programs. That's literally a quote from the article. The U.S. using its leverage should Israel seek increased support for its operations against Iran, and Russia incurring Israeli casualties by employing sophisticated air defense systems against Israeli warplanes operating in Syria. So basically support to Iran, or maybe using force against Israeli assets over Syrian airspace. Those seem to kind of be the two main triggers that might instigate change in Israeli policy vis-a-vis Ukraine. So that's not really surprising, and it's not really damaging even that information is out there. I think anybody who follows Israel, or even a layman like me, pretty much already knew this stuff. That's not shocking. So that's not that damaging. There was another item about Israel that actually probably will be a little damaging, which is that apparently, allegedly, we can't say for sure. It was said in the article I read, this is the New York Times article about the subject. They said that at least one of the documents had been altered prior to release, so it was not the original document. So that suggests that maybe there's an effort here by whoever leaked the documents to cause some damage somehow by making a document look worse than it is, or maybe even partly fabricating something that looks damaging. Or on the other hand, the US government could be lying about that, and maybe they're just saying that one of the documents was altered in order to try to give them some, how should I say, plausible deniability. So if any one of the articles could be wrong, then they could always say, well, whichever one is the most damaging, that's the one. It's not as though the US government hasn't lied before, so that's entirely within the realm of possibility. I just can't say for sure. But the one that did the damage is the one that said that Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, actually encouraged some of its staff to participate in the protests that have been happening in Israel over the past few months against the government.
Huh.
And if that's true, it's not necessarily surprising. In general, from what I've been reading about the protests, there's a lot of people within the security apparatus within Israel that are pretty skeptical about the changes that the government is trying to make. So it's plausible. It's possible they may have done that, although it would be very much in breach of norms, since security institutions are supposed to be apolitical. They're not supposed to pick sides. So that could be a thing. That could be representative of Israel's intelligence agency overstepping its bounds, which could result in pushback from the Netanyahu government of some kind. It's worth noting that the article mentioned that there were Israeli political commentators who said that the assessment in the leak confused the notions of encouraging and allowing. So it may not be the case that Mossad was encouraging its personnel to participate in the protest. It may be that they were just saying that members were allowed to do it if they wanted to. So that's an important distinction, because allowing implies that they were not overstepping their bounds and that they were just respecting the right of their members to express their political preferences as a part of the normal functioning of Israeli democratic society. They also said that the leak mixed up the actions of former Mossad employees with those of current employees. So it may be that they weren't even talking about people who were currently working for the Mossad, but were merely saying that people who used to work for Mossad were allowed to participate in the protests. So that's a much, much weaker, obviously, in terms of, that wouldn't be damaging at all, basically, if that were the case. Let's see, they also had some stuff about the Wagner Group. Supposedly, there are some Turkish contacts, quote unquote, that they met with, whom helped them slip some agents into NATO territory, basically Europe, or maybe probably more like Central Europe or Western Europe, so that they could try to find weapons to procure illegally within Europe and then export them out to Turkey, where they would then be re-exported to Russia. So, we've talked before about how Russia is trying to use Turkey to get around Western sanctions. That's not a new topic. But this would suggest maybe something more, depending on the nature of the Turkish contacts. If they're government contacts, that would suggest Turkish complicity in assisting Russia in sanctions evasion, which would be more serious. But if they're just smugglers or other private actors, it doesn't really matter that much. But other than that, the fact that Russia is using Turkey as a kind of waypoint in order to get around, that's not new, so not that big a deal. Let's see, Battle of Bakhmut. We've talked about this before. So apparently, in February, the Russians came very close to fully encircling the city. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit before about the Battle of Bakhmut. It wasn't so much the city itself that was in danger of falling, so much as the flanks around the city, where the Ukrainian army was pretty steadily being pushed back. So the pinchers surrounding the city very nearly connected and fully cut off the city. But apparently they were stopped by intervention of elite forces from military intelligence, I think it was. Yeah, Ukraine's military intelligence agency offered to send some of its elite units to participate, and apparently they were successful in stopping Bakhmut from being completely cut off, which is why the city still stands in Ukrainian hands today. So while they were successful, the question is, how many casualties did those elite units take? Elite units are elite for a reason. They're hard to build up and train and kind of maintain. And so if you use them, you really need to use them only if you need to, because when they take casualties, it takes a long time to replace them. It's not something you can do overnight. So there is some question about whether or not these elite units may have been originally destined for the spring counteroffensive, or whatever kind of counteroffensive Kiev is planning. But that maybe now they cannot do that on account of having been largely expended, possibly, depending on casualties, in the Battle of Bakhmut. Let's see, as far as Ukraine itself, the leaks did talk a little bit about how the United States is spying on Ukraine's military and political leaders, which, again, no surprise, everybody spies on everybody. It's a little embarrassing, but one interesting note in the article was that the fact that the U.S. was spying on military and political leaders in particular illustrated that Washington was not entirely clear on what exactly Ukraine's fighting strategy was, which is believable because we talked before about how there are certain things that Washington does not want Kiev to do in the war in order to help preserve Western support. And there are some things that Kiev recognizes Washington does not want them to do, but which they want to do anyway. So in so much as there's a gap there, there is room for Kiev to want to hide some things from Washington. And those things are probably what Washington is trying to spy on. So no shock given what we already knew about the relationship, but here it's basically confirmed in so much as it's accurate anyway. Yeah, that's all I had on the leak. I think those were the main items, at least as illustrated by, at least as outlined by the New York Times in their article on it. So overall, like nothing particularly damaging. There's not like big revelations about key weaknesses per se by either Ukraine or Russia or anybody else. There's nothing overly embarrassing about any particular politician or party or group or what have you. Mostly this stuff is the kind of stuff that you could probably just get from open intelligence sources. The fact that the US is spying, obviously we can get unique intelligence from that. So there is some confirmation here of stuff that was suspected but could not really have been proven by open source intelligence. But overall, it doesn't run against anybody's expectations, at least as I understood them. So probably this will just be a blip. You probably won't even hear about it in a few weeks.
So a little something, but not crazy.
Yeah, not too bad. It's nice of the world not to be too crazy while I was busy proofreading.
Thanks, world.
Oh, we actually had a question. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord. That's what's the deal with Clarence Thomas and the undisclosed gifts from the GOP mega donor? Yeah, apparently Clarence Thomas was getting like free trips, like annually for 20 years, something like that. I haven't been following that story too closely either, but
pretty generous of whoever that is.
yeah. So the question there is whether or not there was any kind of quid pro quo, right? Was Clarence Thomas receiving gifts in exchange for rulings? Or was Clarence Thomas perhaps influenced by those donations, by those gifts in his rulings? So, if the answer is yes to either, that would suspect that he's been compromised to some degree as far as the professionalism that he brings to the court, and that perhaps there is then grounds for impeachment, which could happen. But for now, I don't think there's enough information. I mean, even if you did like a full investigation, I don't know how you would necessarily illustrate any kind of link between rulings and the gifts. It seems like it would be pretty difficult, just like it's kind of difficult to illustrate clear-cut bribery in modern lobbying. It's pretty rare for people just to straight up bribe politicians. They're more indirect, such that it's kind of hard to tell whether or not politicians' voting has been influenced by lobbying or whatever other kind of influence that they may be under. So Clarence Thomas is similar in that vein. How are you going to prove that he was corrupted somehow by these gifts? So in that sense, you kind of can't, but there is still the remaining overarching issue of having received gifts at all, especially undisclosed gifts. There's a lot of professions in which it's okay to get gifts so long as you tell people, so long as you make it clear, publicly that you did receive some kind of gift. So I'm not sure. I actually don't know what kind of norms or rules are in place in the Supreme Court as far as the receiving of gifts. So I couldn't tell you there. I don't have a whole lot I can add, comment on this particular issue specifically for that reason. I would have to do more research. But I haven't heard anybody say that he's going to come under investigation or that he's broken any laws, which is what I would have expected to be among the fallout if this had been a pretty significant event.
Mm-hmm.
So for the moment, given the absence of those, I'm a little skeptical that there's been any particular legal breach here. I suspect this is kind of more of a breach of norms than anything. It's a poor practice more than, if it's not illegal, it's definitely a poor choice on his part to take those gifts. Because it does kind of bring the report and it does bring the court in the United States, that is to say the Supreme Court, into disrepute to a degree. And the court's already kind of on shaky ground given all the shenanigans over the past 5 to 10 years. So particularly unwise in light of that fact.
Yeah, he got in some stuff recently because his wife, I think, has either said some stuff or been involved with some January 6th things.
Yeah, she was tweeting, I think, during January 6th in support of the assailants.
Yeah.
Or whatever your preferred descriptor for them would be.
Felons.
There you go. As you like. But yeah, without reading more about relevant norms on the court, I can't add much. So I apologize. Not a great answer. If there was any legal shenanigans, I'm sure there will be, significantly more items in the news about investigations and whatnot. But for now, I haven't seen that.
We'll see what comes of that. Yeah, there were multiple people who asked about a China-Taiwan update of some kind. I know we've covered this quite a few times in the past, but people are always curious if China's actually going to do something this time. It's kind of related to another question that was similar of, will China try to overtake the world reserve currency of USD? I told them that you would not agree with that.
Yeah, that's kind of it's kind of this urban myth that refuses to die. That the foundation of American economic power is rooted in the fact that the US dollar is the leading reserve currency in the world, and that if that dollar could be removed from that position, knocked down from the pedestal, then other currencies could move in to fill that role, and that the United States economy would significantly deteriorate, and that the U.S. would kind of be at a more equal footing with other powers, or maybe even collapse, depending on how far you want to take the argument. But it's not grounded in economics or finance. That's not how reserve currencies work. I think part of the issue, we've talked about this before, but part of the issue is that during the 70s, when the Bretton Woods system was de facto collapsing, there was a period when the US dollar's position was in serious jeopardy, and where effectively the only thing that saved it was US government pressure on Saudi Arabia specifically to take petrodollars and buy treasuries. And that was able to defer crisis. That was able to defer the dollar's slide and help stabilize U.S. finances. But I think that that event has kind of set the notion that the U.S. depends on petrodollars and its status as a root. That the U.S. depends on petrodollars and the U.S. dollar's status as the world's lead reserve currency in order to maintain stability, fiscally, economically, etc. But that's not really the case. That particular moment in time was the product of very specific circumstances in that time. Again, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the establishment of free-floating currencies, the lack of depth in international financial markets, which were still effectively recovering from the Second World War, if not the early 20th century in general. So after the 70s, starting with the 80s, you really see those factors changing. And at this point, international liquidity is way, way deeper than it was in the 70s. Like, nobody depends on petrodollars anymore to keep them afloat, unless you're Egypt or something. But that's different. And as far as reserve currencies, it's just it doesn't work like a currency derives its value specifically from being a reserve currency. Currencies do derive some value from demand for them in order to be used in international business deals. But it's not like the US dollar is the only one, right? I think the dollar is at like 60% in terms of reserve currencies. So it's not like everybody just holds dollars. Like, generally people hold mixes of currencies in order to kind of hedge against risk. And also it kind of depends on, what region you're in. Like, in general, countries that trade more with China and are closer to China will actually use renminbi to a limited degree. Dollars are still popular, but, there are local regional currencies that can be used, euros, what have you, Japanese yen, if you like. So even if the US dollar lost some of the public's confidence in it, such that it became less prominent relative to other currencies as a reserve currency, the result of that would not be a collapse in the dollar's value. It would be a mild decline in value relative to other currencies, and then a decline in the percentage of reserve currencies held as dollars, right? So instead of being like 60 some percent, it might be 40 some percent or something. And then the percentages for other currencies would increase to kind of make up for the gap. So that's not catastrophic, right? That's pretty manageable. Like, the value of the dollar and the performance of the US economy owes a lot more to production, the provision of goods and services in the United States. And that's still going fairly strong overall. And so long as that's the case, the dollar will probably be fine. I've said before on here that the real root of both the value of the US dollar and the US economy writ large is rule of law in the United States. So long as the United States has rule of law such that you can have confidence that your property will not be arbitrarily seized, and so long as the economy continues to produce relatively more growth than other developed economies, that is such a airtight, awesome combination that the dollar's value will not be shaken, like, just fundamentally.
And China does not have rule of law.
No, they do not. It's not chaotic. I'm not saying like it's just Mad Max, but your property is not sacrosanct in China's legal system, right? The party gets what it wants, and if they want to take something from you, they could just do it. There are no legal protections there. Hypothetically, the US government could do the same, depending. But overall, legal protections in the United States are way, way more respected and held in much higher regard than those in China, such that it's a major advantage for the United States over China in terms of economic performance.
Yeah, so it seems like it's less faith in the current value of the US dollar, and it's more faith in the process of how the US does stuff, which makes us less vulnerable to a power spike of any given political party or leader or whatever.
Yeah, roughly. I'm speaking abstractly in that sense. More specifically, the issue is exports and investment. The United States still exports a lot of stuff that people want. So that inherently generates demand for dollars, since in order to buy the stuff the US exports, you generally have to pay in dollars. So there's some ingrained demand just from that. And then there's investment, which technically, when I say investment, I mean investment into the United States from abroad, which technically counts as an export. So the United States gets a lot of money from abroad in the form of investment. And again, that just comes from the combination of rule of law and decent growth, right? There are other economies you can invest in that are safe investments where they have rule of law, but none of them really generate enough growth to make them more attractive than the United States, right? You can invest in the UK or France or what have you, and your money will probably be safe, right? But you're not going to get as much for your money. You won't get as much return on your investment.
What are some of the other countries? You listed UK and France.
Just any developed country, basically. Any country with rule of law. would be kind of a peer competitor to the United States in terms of competing for foreign investment. So relative to those competitors, the United States is attractive just because we have more growth. You can get a higher return on investment here. There are other countries where you can get a higher return than in the United States, but the issue there is safety, right? Those other countries do not have as much security for your investment on account of perhaps a lack of rule of law or corruption or some other issues. Developing economies almost invariably grow faster than developed economies, and in that sense, they're more attractive as targets of investment. But you run risk of losing your investment just because of political bullshit, corruption, or whatever other happenstance may occur that could lead you to losing your investment on account of weak political institutions. So the U.S. has an ideal combination there, and that combination is the bedrock by which the U.S. economy is able to succeed relative to rivals. Which is why it's really important for the judiciary not to fuck around and undermine confidence in it. It would be great if they could stop doing that.
Can you guys stop fucking around with that? Thanks.
But yeah, that's why the reserve currency theory about the US dollar and whatnot doesn't really hold water. And it's why that efforts by the Chinese government or any other government to try to supplant the dollar are probably going to fail because they generally lack those advantages. Like China can generate pretty good growth, and that could generate demand for the renminbi. If they would open up their capital controls, there would be a lot of demand for the renminbi, specifically because China is a major exporter. But they're not going to be an attractive target for investment on account of, and I say that relatively speaking, there's a lot of investment that comes into China. But relative to the United States, China's not as attractive because when you invest in China, your investment is always going to be subject to the whims of the Communist Party of China. Like if you do or say something that pisses them off, or if your local partners that you've teamed up with lose favor with local officials, you're kind of screwed. And there's not going to be any recourse. Like if the party says that you're going to lose your property, then there's no appeal. Then it's just done and it's over. Tough break. So there's an element of gambling with investing in China. And in general, if you look at the investment flows into China, they generally comprise one of two things. Either it's portfolio investment that represents the relatively risky part of an investment portfolio. Investors have, umpteen billions of dollars to invest in. Generally, they prefer to invest most of it into safe investments of one kind or another. And then there's a small percentage relative to the whole that they invest in relatively risky assets. So China generally benefits in terms of portfolio investment from the risky part of the global portfolio. If China could have rule of law, they would get more money because they would be getting that safe investment money as part of that global portfolio. But as is, they haven't done that yet. Now, another big source of investment is foreign direct investment. And that's where foreign investors just invest directly into a specific factory or some other project in which they actually build something in China. And they could do that maybe in partnership with a local producer of some kind, or maybe they could just own it lock, stock, and barrel all on their own. That's a little harder to do if you don't have connections, but it does happen. So that kind of investment also occurs. And generally, you have to have a lot of confidence in your connections, in China to make that happen. And generally, it's larger companies, I think, that do that. Smaller companies find it much more difficult to navigate China. So in that sense, they generally rely more on something like outsourcing, which is very different. That's where you just buy from a Chinese producer that already exists. But yeah, FDI can happen if you're willing to gamble a little bit, and if you think you have strong enough connections. But the fact that you rely on connections so much just kind of underlines my point here. Without rule of law, you need to know somebody in the know within China's political system in order to have confidence that your shit isn't just going to be stolen from you. So that you can have some recourse.
Why doesn't China switch to rule of law?
The party does not want to give up power over China. Because inherently, if you implement a system that features rule of law, then you're accepting that there are some things that you as a government or political party cannot do, and that you have to restrain yourself if, say, a judge, if the judicial system says this thing that you're doing is illegal and you have to stop. So the Communist Party of China does not want to accept that kind of restraint. It wants full, unfettered access to the levers of power within China. Yeah, a lot of what authoritarian political parties do is just trying to maintain control, right? And from their perspective, having an independent judiciary that may or may not let them do something that the party thinks is critical to its continued hold on power is just not acceptable to them. So they're never going to do that, realistically speaking. Not voluntarily, not in the absence of some kind of cataclysm.
Yeah, so they would give up a lot of power in the short term, and they would prefer that over more money in their economy.
Yeah, exactly. For the Communist Party of China and for authoritarian governments everywhere, stability and retaining their hold on power, those are their paramount objectives. Everything else can come later. Like, they can make plenty of money. They can basically make infinite money, since effectively their citizens are their subjects that produce wealth for them. So they don't have to worry about money too much, unless there's a lot of competition within the power structure, in which case it could be a problem. But in general, they're a lot more focused on ensuring that the country as a whole is stable, such that they can extract value from it, or maintain stability, or achieve some other, political objective, depending on the nature of the raison d'etre for the government's rationality for being in power. I would point out, too, that I mentioned the capital controls before, and the fact that China has capital controls is another reason why they're going to struggle to push the renminbi as a potential alternative to the dollar. One of the reasons that's where you just prevent, where you have a lot of restrictions on the flow of money in and out of your country. So if somebody wants to invest in your country, or if somebody wants to take money in your country and move it out, they may or may not be able to do that. It's very easy to do if you don't have significant capital controls, or maybe none at all. But in China's case, they have a lot of rules on that. And part of that has to do with trying to regulate their exchange rate. They don't want their exchange rate collapsing or significantly ascending in value or otherwise being volatile. So they try to sterilize it and keep it stable as much as possible. And the main way they do that is just by restricting the flow of US dollars into and out of China. One of the reasons that, maybe you remember this, we talked about it a long time ago, back in like 2017, 2018. There was a period in the middle of the last decade, the 2010s, in which a lot of Chinese corporations were actually investing a lot of money abroad. FDI, mergers, what have you, IPOs on Western stock exchanges, stuff like that. And it really looked like China was kind of finally, Chinese firms were finally moving out of China and kind of building a global profile. And then it stopped, like almost overnight. Like it was just very common to hear headlines about them being very active in global investment circles. And then suddenly they stopped doing it. And the reason they stopped is because the Chinese government did not want powerful actors within China, which of course Chinese corporations are, to have the freedom to move money out of the country. Part of that was because they didn't want to lose control over the exchange rate, since a lot of money was moving out of China as a part of these corporate activities. Part of it also had to do with corruption. There was a strong suspicion, and probably an accurate one, that these kinds of foreign investments were being used by businessmen and probably also politicians as a way to sneak money that they had stolen by way of bribes, corruption, what have you, out of the country so that they could get it into foreign bank accounts where it would be beyond the reach of the Communist Party of China. So that, of course, is a problem in and of itself. Not only for the purposes of fighting corruption, which of course undermines the legitimacy of the party, but also for national security reasons, since if you have a lot of money overseas, then you're at risk of being compromised. Like if a foreign intelligence service finds out that you have a lot of money overseas, then they could try to use access to that money as leverage over you. Basically, they could threaten to steal it from you, and if you don't if you don't cooperate with them, right? So the Chinese government didn't want people to be compromised like that, so that was part of the reason for the crackdown. So controlling the flow of money is important to the Communist Party of China, but however many upsides there might be to that, the downside is that it makes renminbi fairly rare in forex markets, and because it's rare, it's relatively more expensive, and traders internationally don't prefer to use it. It's just too complicated, too time intensive, and too unavailable generally to make it a viable competitor to, say, the US dollar. The dollar by exchange is just readily available. It's just everywhere. Everybody has dollars. So if you need to get some quickly in order to facilitate some kind of business deal, you can do that. Like pretty much any bank can help you with that, and at relatively low cost. So the dollar is inherently a difficult competitor for that reason. Between the fact that it's just extremely liquid, it's just everywhere, and its underlying value is very, very good and stable to the point where you can have a lot of confidence that whatever deal you're doing, you're not going to get screwed over by random fluctuations in the forex market. Does that make sense?
Yeah, roughly. Yeah, some of it, I think a lot of finance stuff boils down to the concept of confidence.
Yeah.
Confidence in how your money is going to behave, and how you have a lot of different choices on the table. And China does have a big economy, and I think a lot of people just look at the size of the economy of China and they're like, oh, they could be competing with the dollar and stuff, but there's a lot more at play than just having a large national economy.
Yeah.
That's how all of
if it were just size, then China would be doing very good in that regard. But as is, there are other critical variables that they're pretty weak on. It's worth mentioning, too, that even if China were successful, it would not inherently be a bad thing for the U.S. One of the problems with having a currency be a reserve currency is that the value of the currency is somewhat inflated, and that's actually bad for your exporters. It's better. It would be better if the dollar lost some value, because then the United States would be more export competitive. And I have seen some economists argue that one of the reasons that American exporters and the American manufacturing sector in particular have struggled over the past 30, 40 years has been because, in part, of the inflated value of the dollar stemming from its status as a reserve currency. Now, I generally have more confidence in the U.S. manufacturing sector than perhaps those analysts do. It's not as bad off as some people make it out to be. But there is some substance to the argument that the U.S. dollar as reserve currency does inhibit the United States economy to some degree. It makes us relatively more, not dependent, that's not quite the right, makes us import relatively more than we would otherwise. That's the flip side of not being able to export. Is when your currency is more valuable, your exports are more expensive, and so you lose market share to competitors. But having a more valuable currency also means that foreign stuff is cheaper, and so imports go up when your currency devalues, or increases in value, rather. So long story short, if the US dollar did lose its status as premier reserve currency, the impact would not be a collapse of the US economy. The result would be relatively less imports and relatively more exports, which would not be catastrophic for anybody. So, yeah, talk about reserve currencies and the US dollar and whatnot tends to be very, very overwrought. It's a subject I've encountered a lot. And we've talked more than once about this over the years. It comes up periodically. I think I was even reading. There was an article on Reddit about the BRICS nations talking about trying to do more trade in their own currencies. And there was a lot of Brazilians in the comments who were excited about the prospect that they could get off the US dollar and finally put a nail in the coffin of US imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
And, regardless of how much you may like or dislike the United States, the fact is that, the BRICS nations, for one, are unlikely to be able to significantly shift their trade into currencies other than the US dollar. That has more to do with other factors. But even if they did, it would not really undermine the United States that much, if at all. So hopefully that answered the question to some degree.
Yeah, more or less. This big scale economic stuff is always going to be pretty muddy just for how many different variables are involved. So it's one of those kind of like hearing about quantum physics. You hear about it, but you don't necessarily expect to have a complete grasp on it after just a friendly conversation.
Yeah. Well, maybe now would be a good time for the usual disclaimer. I am not an expert in everything I talk about in here. I have more of the background in economics, some in foreign policy. And, if I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So if I ever say anything that's stupid, wrong, or biased, please do correct me. Chad is encouraged to participate in that regard.
Yep, we like
I don't
our
read chat
corrections.
well.
Yeah, he doesn't read chat, but we'll publish the VOD, and then he can read it, learn some stuff from everybody. We did have one viewer who ended up having to ban. They were full of all of the conspiracy theory kits. It was pretty cool. They were like, the dollar hasn't been good since Nixon in 1971. Buy gold.
Yep.
Buy gold and silver.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of guys that only feel safe having their money in some kind of rare metal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, lots of libertarians are like that. And that's part of the reason why cryptocurrency became so popular. It was seen as an alternative to fiat currency.
Mm.
It was seen to have its value rooted in scarcity rather than fiat currency, which is not really rooted in anything except the market confidence. So yeah, there's always people, usually with backgrounds in some degree in finance, who really, really push gold hard and are very, very skeptical about fiat currency and want to audit the Fed. And, they always have a whole laundry list of things that they would change if they could. Economists are not very high on restoring the gold standard like a lot of these guys are. I see it more amongst finance guys than economists. Economists are generally pretty positive about fiat currency and our current approach to managing monetary policy, however flawed it may be. Just different perspectives on what's best for the economy.
Chad is asking about a particular person, Peter Zehan. Do you know who this person is?
People keep asking me about him. I really need to just sit down and read some of his stuff so I can have something more substantive to say about him.
What does he do?
He's a geopolitical commentator.
Oh.
Yeah, he's written books. He has a YouTube channel. Well, he has YouTube videos, rather. He does seminars. He's very well known. He's definitely a public figure that is well known in geopolitical circles. In general, I'm not really a big proponent. I don't dislike him, but his views and opinions seem to be not quite up to the standard of, say, an expert on a given region per se. Mm-hmm. For example, if I really want to know more about what's going on in Europe or Asia or whatnot, I would generally go look at, say, a regional expert of some kind working at a think tank. Mm-hmm. Maybe look at a report, maybe try to find their Twitter if they have one, see if they had anything interesting there, see if they published any papers, working paper, articles, stuff like that. And generally those people are kind of the best source. Or I could just look at, newspapers or other media in the region in question and try to, make inferences based off of that. But Zehan is not really my go-to in that regard. You will learn about the world if you read Zehan's stuff, but his evidence and argumentation are not as good as the stuff that you would get from like real actual professionals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that kind of makes sense. Where the wider the realm that you're talking about, the harder it is to be fully accurate.
Yeah.
You can't be an expert on everything.
Yeah, and he does have like very broad, expansive commentary. You know, it kind of encompasses a lot of different subjects and issues. He does a good job of synthesizing things. You know, he tries to kind of connect things together and talk about how, you know, say demographics are going to impact this or that country's, you know, fate and how it interacts with what we know about how economies work and whatnot. So, you know, something like that, you know, that's decent commentary. But you know, again, he struggles with details, right? Which is what you would expect an expert to be better at.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, some of his opinions are just so kind of ambiguous as to kind of be almost meaningless. Like he says that India, for example, has control over the fate of China because India has control over the Straits of Malacca. You know, I saw him talk about that at a seminar.
Mm-hmm.
Not a seminar I was at, just online. I was watching a YouTube video of him.
Mm-hmm.
But he was talking about how, you know, because India has control over the Straits of Malacca on account of the Andaman Islands, whether or not China succeeds or fails going forward is entirely up to them, which is such a broad, sweeping statement that ignores so many other relevant factors as to kind of be just outrageous. You know, it's just it's crazy. Like, that's just too broad a statement.
Yeah.
I don't think you can make that argument unless you address all of the other factors involved, and he really didn't. So, you know, some of the stuff he says is pretty smart and he can be insightful, but overall the quality is kind of, it's not as high as what you could get from other sources.
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest advantage that Zehan has, besides being able to synthesize lots of different information together into sometimes insightful analysis, the other big advantage he has is that he's very digestible. You know, he doesn't really present like overly complicated ideas that kind of get lost in the weeds. He's very good at presenting like easily understandable concepts that tie together those different ideas and whatnot in a way that a viewer can understand, even if they don't necessarily have a background in international relations, politics, military science, you know, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
So synthesizing and presentation are like big advantages for him, and I think those are the main reasons that he's been able to build such a strong brand in geopolitics. I would point out too, and this is not to knock, you know, people who are interested in geopolitics, but geopolitics, as it was taught to me anyway when I was in grad school, is not an actual field of science, right? You can't get like a PhD in geopolitics. At least not one that I'm aware of anywhere. You know, if you want to study something, you're going to get a degree in something like international relations, economics, political economy, something like that, basically. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing that you can do like specifically in the field of geopolitics. So it's kind of an abstract field that encompasses a lot of other fields. And the barrier to entry is much lower, right? Like, it's much harder to pretend to be a doctorate in economics than it is to be a quote unquote expert in geopolitics. You know, anybody can do that. Well, almost anybody. So keep that in mind when you kind of view his stuff. He's not like approaching it from the perspective of somebody who's studied a particular field for a very long time. You know, he's more of a generalist who tries to tie different pieces of information together into something that is understandable.
Yeah, to me it sounds like his content is more for a lay person than for the experts to like shift the field overall. It's more so for people who aren't into this. He's more into it than your average bear, so for him to make some commentary about the big picture, I think might help people who don't follow the big picture. The issue is the broader the issues you talk about, like you said, it's hard to be technically accurate about everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't want to downsell him too much because, you know, he has produced insightful stuff. Like, you can learn from him, right? So, you know, if you're looking for like an introduction to geopolitical issues, he's a pretty decent source for that. But if you want to get into the granular details, if you want to really like get it, if you really want to get a strong reading on what's happening in a region and really understand the underlying drivers, you would have to go well beyond Zehan, which takes a lot more time, which is why Zehan, again, that's one of Zehan's advantages. It doesn't take nearly as much of a commitment in time and resources to like go through his stuff than then to go through, say, the academic literature, or to go through all of the relevant statistics, to go through local regional media and whatnot. You know, all of that is much more time intensive. So I don't begrudge anybody for going to Zehan for, you know, an introductory understanding of these kinds of topics.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess long story short, not bad.
Not bad, but he's not a pioneer in the scene who's shifting the landscape on a professional level. But good for lay people who want to learn a bit. That's basically kind of what we're doing here too as well, though. It's like, this is a segment that's for fun, and Agent Smith does read a lot of world news and knows a lot of stuff about history, but you're not really an authority on a topic where you've devoted your life to a thing and like you're the official expert that people turn to about it.
Yeah. I don't want to make it seem like I'm arguing that I'm better than Peter Zehan. I'm not. You know, I have a lot that I could learn from him. I'm just giving you a critique, right? So, you know, don't take that as me tooting my own horn. You know, that comes very unnaturally to me. I'm much too shy and timid for that. You doing okay on time?
Yeah, go for another like 20 to 30.
Okay. Well, have we blown through all of the questions?
I can double check in a second how much of them we're through. I think we got a lot of the main topic. There was another follow-up question about, is China going to actually go for Taiwan to get the microchips? We've addressed this many times, but has anything changed on that front, or is it the same?
Nothing new there. You know, China's been puffing itself up to look scary over the past couple weeks on account of Taiwan's president coming to visit the United States.
Wow, so that's why.
Yeah, that's the only new thing, really. But, you know, that's not really indicative of any, well, that's not necessarily indicative of any intention by Beijing to escalate the crisis and make it an excuse to invade. More likely, it's just being done. Well, as I said before, performative outrage. You know, they have to appease the nationalists in China so they don't take any heat. So there you go. But I don't think anything's going to come of it. I could be wrong. I'm not, you know, again, I don't have like the power to, you know, to see into the future, but just given what I know now, I strongly suspect that China's just trying to look angry and make a show of things before kind of going back to normal. And as far as the computer chips, I think there is actually a plan in place by which, what's the company? TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Company. There is a plan by which if China did invade, then, and it did look like, you know, the country were going to fall, then they would supposedly sabotage or destroy their equipment such that it would not fall into the hands of the Communist Party of China. So, you know, even if China did take the island, they would not, if that plan is accurate anyway, you know, if that is actually a plan that they have in place, even if China did take the island in that case, they would not be able to reap significant benefits for their tech sector.
So about the same. People asked about a update on France and the protests there.
I don't think I saw anything new. I know the protests are escalating, but I haven't seen any evidence the government is thinking about changing tack. So yeah, I don't have any updates there.
About the same on that front.
I did read an article about, I I'm not sure what they changed the name to. They used to be called the National Front. Basically, Marine Le Pen's party, the party of the populist right in France. Apparently, they've seen a jump in approval ratings since all the drama began, over the retirement age. So hypothetically, if they are able to maintain that momentum from that bump in approval, they could potentially ride that to some kind of favorable election outcomes later on. A lot of people in France getting pretty tired of the establishment options.
Mm-hmm. Going for the other party options. I actually read recently that Germany has a pretty strong Green Party, and with the way their government works, they have a block within government. Like, they're not a majority party, but they have enough people that they do have some influence on policy decisions and that kind of a thing. And their meat consumption is way down in Germany, which is unusual given that that's one of they're like the sausage capital of Europe or whatever. We have more plant-based and stuff like that becoming more common. I heard their meat production was down like 9%.
Huh.
Partly due to the credit of their Green Party.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that may also have something to do with natural gas, since that's an input, I believe, in the process.
Mm.
They derive a lot of what was it? I think it's carbon. Basically, the stuff that they use to seal packages is actually uses like carbonated air or pressurized air, and they get a lot of that as a byproduct from natural gas production.
Huh.
So that may have had an effect on meat production as well.
And
there could be arbitrage happening.
What is arbitrage?
That's where differences in prices result in people selling to the other place where prices are higher.
Mm-hmm.
So, if meat prices are low, well, I should say, if meat prices are higher outside of Germany than they are in Germany, there's an incentive to buy meat in Germany and then sell it abroad.
Mm-hmm.
So that could result in relatively less supply. But generally, that wouldn't result necessarily in too much disruption to supply in Germany. Could be a lot of things, but yeah, it doesn't surprise me that the Green Party in Germany would kind of be focusing on stuff like that. Mm. It's worth pointing out that they're only a coalition partner in a coalition that includes two other parties. So it's not like it's just the SPD, which is the main left-wing party in Germany. It's not like the SPD is in a coalition with the Green Party on an equal footing. Mm-hmm. The SPD won a lot more votes than either of their coalition partners. And the Green Party is on a relatively equal footing in terms of the seats it won with the third coalition partner, which I believe is the FDP, the Free Democrats, something like that. I forget the actual name. But the Free Democrats are a liberal political party, like a classical liberal party, as people in the United States would call it. So as you can imagine, it's a very awkward coalition, right? Greens, liberals, and the SPD all together make for somewhat odd bedfellows. So it's not the case that the Greens can kind of get everything they want. That's in so much as they have been successful, it's been on account of concessions from the SPD more than anything.
Do we have coalitions like that in the U.S.?
We do, but they don't happen in terms of political parties allying with each other. They happen within political parties. Oh. We have people who vote. We have what you would call like one-issue voters, right? People who care about like one specific issue more than others, and people like that would be the kinds of people in Europe who vote for, say, the Green Party or maybe the FDP or maybe a farmers' party. Mm-hmm. The Netherlands Farmers Party actually has been in the news recently. Normally, the parties like that don't win very many votes, but if the major parties can lose enough support, it's possible that their support would be needed for a coalition. And in cases like that, they can extract concessions from the larger parties. But yeah, in the United States, people like that basically assert as much pressure as they can within their preferred political party. So, Democrats are known for being more environmentalist, but there's no inherent reason for that. And basically, it just comes down to particular parts of the country generally where environmentalism is relatively more important. People like that are able to vote in what are, in effect, environmental green candidates. And those candidates go on into Washington. And, like we were talking about before, parties are more of just a label in the United States. So they can vote however they want for the most part, except in cases of when there's like maybe a big issue or something. But overall, they can. And so if you're like a one issue candidate, right, if you were mostly elected for one issue, like, say, green issues, you can vote accordingly, even if it's against your party. So, in effect, we do have multiple parties, you might say, or the equivalent of multiple parties, what would pass in Europe for multiple parties in the United States within the context of American politics. It just manifests differently.
Yeah, we talked about concepts like that a little bit with countries like Brazil, where they just have so many goddamn political parties.
Yeah, they have quite a few. Yeah, politicians in Brazil can be quite mercenary. I mean, we were talking about flipping parties before. In Brazil, that's very common. And generally, it's associated more with corruption, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if we have any Brazilians in chat, but let us know. Like, is party flipping in Brazilian politics generally attributed more to corruption, or is it more due to something else? My impression is that it's more corruption, but I could easily be wrong. Yeah, you can see like the different coalitions in the United States if you break down the major voting blocks in U.S. politics. Like the Democratic Party in the United States generally targets minorities, like African Americans, Hispanics, etc., which generally support the Democratic Party relatively more. Younger people tend to vote more Democrat. Students tend to vote more Democrat, although that's not really a voting bloc per se. It's more just young people. Labor unions and the working class generally support, used to. Labor unions certainly support Democrats, but labor unions have also been getting smaller over time. Let's say organized labor almost invariably supports Democrats. So, those are sort of your broad-based different groups in the United States, which would probably have their own parties in a separate, in a multi-party system. But as is, they come together and they're all within the umbrella of the Democratic Party. And also urban professionals. That's the major one. That's the one I should have started with. They also tend to vote more for Democrats, although that's more of a recent development. It's kind of emerged over the past couple decades. So the Republican Party, in contrast, is generally more national security Republicans, people who are more nationalistic and are more focused on, say, foreign policy issues or maybe on immigration. So that's one group. And then you've also got libertarians who are more interested in civil rights and things like that, but also small government, laissez-faire government, in other words. And probably you could kind of point to, the working class also has become, that's sort of the newest member of the coalition. That's something that's emerged also over the past couple decades. That's especially the case in rural areas. So, rural working class people have become a core partner within the Republican coalition over the past couple decades. And rural areas in general have always been, well, not always been, but have become solidly Republican.
Is that a kind of global trend where rural communities are more conservative? Because the Republican Party is considered to be the conservative party.
Yeah. Is there a global trend of a rising tide of conservatism? Is that what you mean?
No. Just are rural communities more conservative than urban in general?
Yeah, I've always assumed so, and I haven't seen too many examples, or really any examples to kind of disprove it. I'm sure there must be examples somewhere,
Mhm.
maybe like a hippie commune or something. But yeah, for the most part, rural areas are almost invariably conservative. You can see that especially in developing countries, because generally there are people living in developed areas. Well, not developed area. There are people living in developing countries who live not that much differently than their ancestors, like centuries ago, or maybe even thousands of years ago, in particularly undeveloped cases, and well, undeveloped regions rather. So in those cases, you can see very clearly how a rural area would inherently be more conservative. There just hasn't been enough economic development to disrupt the way of life that has been sort of set in place for a very long time.
Mm.
Generally, if you want to see disruption to conservatism, however it's defined anywhere, you need some degree of economic development to create urban spaces that can act as that can act as hosts for alternative lifestyles. And when I say alternative lifestyles, I don't mean like LGBT. I mean just urban lifestyles as opposed to traditional rural lifestyles. In the case of like South Asia and China, rural areas have been worked and cultivated for thousands of years, and people there developed, extensive, very impressive cultures in their own right. Their own literature, their own customs, etc. And that was in place for thousands of years. And then along come modern cities, which are just totally different. Like all of the norms that had been established previously were specifically designed for like rural culture, a rural society.
Mhm.
Urban culture was not nearly as developed. And so when urban areas became paramount, emerged and ascended with the Industrial Revolution, traditional cultures and norms really struggled to apply themselves to the urban context. And the result is new cultures that emerged within those urban areas that kind of challenged and conflicted with the traditional rural culture. It's actually less bad in the United States, one could argue, than in a developing country, because in a developing country, again, traditional society has deep, deep roots that go back thousands of years, and people are very proud of it, especially nationalists. And that creates a lot of difficulties with urban cultures that emerge with urban areas, because a lot of urban cultures derive relatively more cultural influence from international influences, especially from the West. And so, in the minds of a sort of rural, traditional nationalist in a developing country, people living in their country's urban areas often look very, even suspiciously similar to people in the West. And that inherently drives conflict and creates resistance to a degree, resistance to economic development, urban spaces, urban cultures, etc. In the United States, it's not as much of a problem because we don't have a traditional culture that goes back like thousands of years, right?
Mm.
Our culture is relatively new. Even if you want to date it like with English culture is only what, maybe 1,000 years old, if that.
Mm.
So it's not nearly as old as say India or China. But if you want to look just at American culture specifically as something separate from English culture, we only go back a couple hundred years. So the divide between urban and rural culture is not as deep as it is in other places.
Mm.
And that sounds counterintuitive because I know it's like a major driver of political conflict in the modern context. Uh, really, it's been a driver of conflict in the United States from the start. but big picture, it's not as bad as it is in other places, for which we are very lucky.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the longest continuous cultures like China and India, and the difference between a farmer in India and how they live life and what their relevant issues are, and then someone who's in one of the major cities and they're a university student studying tech. That's like a massive difference between those demographics in terms of their traditions and what they care about and what they want to prioritize.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a dramatic change. And cultures change very slowly. So invariably, there's going to be churn, conflict, and whatnot, and disagreement about how to construct new norms in order to manage the new social contexts that arise in urban areas and with economic development. a lot of people try to just take the traditional norms and apply them to urban areas, and invariably, like, it doesn't work, right?
Mm.
Because a lot of those traditional norms are just designed for a very different context. You can see that kind of tension in places like Iran, over the veil. A veil can make sense, like in a traditional context, in a traditional rural context, because historically, women were borderline commodities. You wanted to try to marry them into a good family so that you could improve the network of your extended family. But nobody wants like a bad woman, right? So you have to ensure that your daughter adhered as much as possible to whatever prestige culture exists in your society. And in the context of Iran, that meant traditional Islamic society. Again, there's a whole other debate about whether the veil is Islamic or not. I'm not going to get into that, but that was prestigious, to cover up so that you could project modesty on the part of a woman, anyway.
Yeah, it's sort of like piety in a sense, and that is important in more conservative and traditional cultures in general, is adherence to the old ways. So
Yeah.
they're not really thinking about like, okay, is this practice a good one? Do we want to keep this? That's already progressive thinking if you're asking those questions.
Exactly.
Conservative thinking would be, this has been the tradition. This was the tradition back in what they might consider the golden era of whenever Muhammad was around or the caliphates were around, whatever. But yeah, in the modern context, it's very weird to like force people to wear any particular clothing outside of maybe school uniforms.
Yeah. Yeah, but more to the point, it doesn't serve any particular purpose.
Yeah.
In a traditional context, if you can marry your daughter into a better family, that means more access to better resources for your family. You've effectively extended your personal network to that new, better off family, and they can help you out more so than, say, a poorer family could.
Yeah.
And also, it helps a lot to have your family's reputation be better, just in general. There's not a lot of knowledge that spreads very quickly, like historically speaking, right? People can't do a background check on you on a computer if you're living in 500 BC, right? So what you have to go on is reputation. And in order to bolster your reputation as much as possible, in order to maximize your gains, you adhere to prestige culture of whatever kind you can. So being seen to be adhering to prestigious culture, that has tangible benefits to you. Like, it really does mean something in a traditional context. But now in a modern context, like, it doesn't matter so much. Like, if people can do a background check now, they can see, if you've been convicted of murder, or, if you're a drunkard or whatever. Like, it's just way easier now. So maintaining a reputation is not as important. It's still important, but it's not nearly as important. And also, urban society is way more atomized, so family is not as important in general. It's actually much more viable to build your own brand, your own identity, independent of your family, and do your own thing, just based off of the quality of your work as a professional. So the priorities there are just radically different. And as a result, there's just no practical reason to take the old norms and try to shoehorn them in, like, other than maintaining prestige culture as it existed, for centuries. Like, there's no other particular reason to do it. It's basically just sentimentality, almost.
Yeah, what you were talking about with wanting your kids to be a certain way and adhering to traditions, a lot of marriage traditionally was strategic, where you're trying to set up your family in a better position than the current generation for the next generation. So you're trying to get your kid to marry up, and you're trying to show that they, like you said with the prestige culture, that they follow the norms and traditions in a way that increases their desirability factor, independent of like what is the wealth of this family financially. Like, you might not be able to change your socioeconomic status, but you can change the way that you dress and like how you practice your religion more easily. Feels like.
Yeah, it's there's much less friction there. There's much less resistance to that. You can, previously you could be punished severely for not adhering to, norms like that. But now in an urban modern setting, like, yeah, you want to dye your hair pink or whatever, like, go ahead. Nobody cares. it does not benefit me personally in any way to go and reproach somebody for looking a certain way. Like, I don't get anything out of that,
Some
like
people,
financially or whatever.
yeah. For some people, it seems like it gives them a temporary distraction from the self-loathing process. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't give you any direct, tangible benefits.
Now, that said, I could say that one of the benefits to maintaining traditional culture is that it maintains traditional expectations. So, if you want to navigate a world that is just full of people who you don't know and whose values you don't know and whom you don't know whether or not you can trust, it can be helpful to have norms in place that allow you to navigate that. So if you have a prestige culture in place, and you have confidence that anybody embracing those values and norms is trustworthy, then you do gain some benefit from knowing who to trust. Because obviously trust is important, for people individually as well as for societies writ large. So to a degree, you could say that by enforcing traditional norms, you're trying to build trust in a society. So there is some merit to that. But that's also a very abstract argument, and traditional norms are not necessarily the intuitive way by which to achieve trust building. You could just as easily do it through, say, public education, by which you expose people to each other and illustrate that you can trust your fellow citizens. Or instead of using traditional values, you can substitute traditional values with something like nationalism, which inherently teaches you to trust people you don't know based solely on their nationality. So there's other ways to do it than through sheer traditionalism. But some people don't want to give it up. Again, in the United States, we don't have thousands of years of tradition, so it's a lot easier for people here to kind of eschew traditionalism. But again, say a place like Iran, they do have thousands of years of tradition, and people do respect it and have respected it and upheld it for a long time. So in a sense, it's understandable that people in places like that would still try to push and support and propagate traditional norms like that. It makes sense from their perspective. All this new stuff, all these new cities, new technologies, this is all newfangled bullshit. They don't know whether or not to trust that. Much more trustworthy in the context of a traditional society like Iran is everything that's been working since 2000 BC. Or however long. I'm sure Iranian society is very old, so however old it is. So inherently, it's harder to overturn norms that have been in place for thousands of years than norms that have been in place since, say, 1776. I hope people aren't too bored by the sociological conversation.
I think it's fun talking about some of the big picture stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, but to answer your question, yes, I would agree that rural areas in general are invariably more conservative.
We'll probably wrap in about 10 to 15, so if there are any other things you wanted to hit.
Could probably blow through the Ukraine stuff.
Sure.
Because I did have a little bit there. I was looking through the flags to see if we had anybody from France, because I was going to ask. I only see one flag, though, so if we have anybody from France listening, the question I had for you had to do with a region of France, which basically was southwestern France. And I wanted to ask if there was anything in particular that French people associate with that region. Like, what is the reputation of southwestern France in France? Because I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about French political geography, I guess. So I've been kind of intermittently looking at different French regions on Wikipedia and other sources, trying to get a feel for them. Obviously, I've heard of like Paris, Brittany, Occitane. I've been reading a little bit about the Rhone, the Rhine. Those areas I'm more familiar with, but I really just don't know shit about like Western France or Southwestern France. Those are kind of black holes.
Southeastern France I know a lot about because my family lived there for 2 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So Nice, I've spent many, many days in Nice. Marseille, we visited lots of times. Provence, another region that I'm pretty familiar with. Generally, like anyone who's French, feel free to correct me. I'm probably super wrong about this, but people in the south of France are, I think, more warm and friendly. It's more of a Mediterranean culture, and kind of makes sense. They're more similar to like Italians and Spaniards and that kind of thing. The food culture is also kind of mixing in some ideas from their neighbors too. So if you go to like southeastern France and you go to Nice, the Italian French fusion is super, super good. Paris kind of falls into that category of like a huge city. So people are really busy and kind of, I wouldn't say mean per se, but it's more of a city culture where you distrust people around you. There are just so many people that it's if you only go to Paris in France, you might think that French people are kind of grumpy or rude, but there are a lot of really nice French people as well, especially in the south of France. And then the north of France, I've heard they speak a pretty different sounding French, but I didn't actually visit northern France too much aside from going to Paris.
Huh.
Paris is an amazing city, though. It looks really, really cool. Lots of awesome monuments. The Arc de Triomphe that heckin' Napoleon built or whatever is so ridiculous of a traffic obstacle. It's a massive, like 5-lane wide roundabout, and it's just pure chaos. If you're a tourist and you rent a car and you drive through that, good luck. Have fun. You'll probably survive, but they actually did a scene there in the new John Wick movie.
Oh, really?
Yeah, John Wick 4.
4. I need to catch up on those. I'm way behind.
Yeah, it's not a super groundbreaking story concept. It's more of an action movie that's done well. And they do some things better than other action movies. Like they have interesting shots that will be a really long shot where he'll fight through like 20 different people all in one long sequence, whereas a lot of other movies will chop it up into different shots. So it gives the combat scenes a different feel that makes them, I don't know what the right word is. It makes it exhausting for the viewer where you feel for the character more. Like you feel like, damn, like he must be tired fighting through all that stuff. And it feels more realistic for the combat anyway. But the story is almost in the fantasy realm. It's so ridiculous.
Really?
This isn't really a spoiler too much because I think it's in the first or the second movie. But if you don't want John Wick spoilers, mute the stream for a second. But basically, heckin' everybody and their brother is an assassin. And someone gets in trouble and they're like, this person, we've cast them out and there's a bounty on their head now. And then it pans over to like one group of people at a restaurant and then they all get the text message on their phone. And it's like, what the fuck? All these people are assassins? And then it pans to another like outdoor street area and they all check their phones and it's like, shit, everyone here is an assassin. Okay. So whenever that happened to me, I was like, all right, this is a tongue-in-cheek kind of fantasy action movie kind of format. But Keanu Reeves is an awesome actor. And yeah, people are saying in the chat, his gun use is very, very good. Like he actually practices and trains as a marksman a bunch. So for action movies, just the skill involved and actual technique is going to be a cut above the rest. And Donnie Yen is in this last movie and he's heckin' amazing. If you haven't seen Ip Man, that's the person who trained Bruce Lee, or at least one of them. And it's a really good movie. I can't remember if I got you to watch that with Kukio, but that was one of my favorite kung fu movies, and Donnie Yen plays the lead in that.
Oh. Yeah, I think you have recommended it to me, but I don't remember sitting down and watching it.
Yeah, I'll link it in Twitch chat and Discord.
I'll definitely have to give that a try.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was probably 10 minutes, wasn't it?
Yeah. If you want to do flags or something, I'm not in a terrible rush. I just need to end early because I'm cat sitting through Tuesday. So a friend of mine has a cat. They just got him like a month ago as well. So they're, I would say, a little bit more cautious and protective than for someone who's had a cat for a lot more years than that. So they wanted me to go check on him, refill his food, give him some attention and stuff every day while they're gone.
Oh, understood.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do that for friends sometimes. Well, let's see. It's kind of limited selection this time. Puerto Rico. Yeah, don't get too many Puerto Rico flags on here.
We do have a regular viewer from Cuba.
Really?
Yeah, and it's interesting because they aren't able to subscribe. Like, based on some of the embargoes or I don't know what, they can watch from Cuba. I'm not sure if they use a VPN for it, but they can't join parties in StarCraft. Like, I couldn't invite them to stuff, so their account had restrictions on it, and they also couldn't subscribe on Twitch. So I don't know what that's about, but shout out to our.
I'm
nice
surprised
viewer
they
from
can
Cuba.
watch it all.
Yeah.
The government down there normally keeps pretty close tabs on access to the internet.
Yeah. Oh, super good joke, real quick. Fear Dragon in the chat. This is a reference to what we talked about before, of farmers and urban people. And he says, a farmer in India has the same #1 priority as the software developer in America. Bugs.
Fair point.
Well played, Robbie.
Fair point. Oh, I think I did see somebody in chat asking about Turkey at one point.
Uh-huh.
Like, how would Turkish-American relations change if the opposition won in Turkey? I think that was the question. They can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But a short answer is relations would not change much. As far as foreign policy, there would probably be a lot of continuity. The spectrum of Turkish politics basically runs from nationalist on one side and then ultra-nationalist on the other. There's not really a lot of variety there.
Are you a nationalist or a rabid nationalist?
Yeah. They do have some others, but like nationalism has a lot of currency in Turkish politics. And in terms of foreign policy in particular, I doubt there would be any real substantive change. If there were significant changes, it would be in domestic politics more than anything. And maybe not even all that much change even there, given the importance of patronage networks. But yeah, I would not expect like a nationalist government in Turkey to be that different than an AKP government. There would probably be a lot of overlap in terms of how they approach, say, Ukraine or NATO or what have you. As the old saying goes, a Turk has no friend but a Turk. That's an attitude they've had for a long time. It's not going to change anytime soon.
Well, cool. I think I'll wrap it up here and get some rest. Appreciate you coming on, even though it's a holiday, technically.
Oh, no problem. Well, thank you for having me. It's always a privilege.
I should be back in the saddle and streaming for this full month. I had a nice week and a bit visit with Trisha, but I should be good for the next couple weekends for some real discussion. And as always, if we left anything out or you want to share anything about the country that you live in, or if we got something completely dead wrong, feel free to leave us a scathing review in the YouTube comments. And we will see you all on the next episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again.
20-minute walk challenge this week.
Ah, damn it. Yeah, I did do it. I did do it last week.
Nice. Well done, sir. You take care of
I'll
yourself.
see you next week. I will meet your challenge.
Nice. Well done. Clapper. Yo, thank you, Agent Smith. Shout out to Dagnip, leading the charge with the Agent Smith enthusiasm today. Not only asking if he was going to be on, but after I told Dagnip when Agent Smith was going to be on, you gave us updates. Agent Smith in 1 hour, 10 minutes! Agent Smith in 42 minutes! Agent Smith in 29 minutes and 40 seconds. That's big. I appreciate that. Let's give someone a nice raid.